There was a moment, I still don't know exactly when it happened, when my life stopped feeling like something I was living and started feeling like something I was maintaining. Not falling apart, not collapsing, just continuing, smoothly, efficiently, emptily. People often imagine breaking points as dramatic events. A loss, a betrayal, a phone call in the middle of the night. Mine was quieter. Mine arrived disguised as success. I had everything I was supposed to want. A stable routine, respectable work, a life that looked complete from the outside. When people asked how I was doing, the answer came automatically. Good. Busy. Can't complain. And I believed it, because believing it required less effort than questioning it. The first sign something was wrong wasn't sadness. It was detachment. I stopped reacting the way I used to. Good news felt neutral. Bad news felt distant. Joy passed through me like weather, noticed but not felt. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself this was balance. I told myself a lot of things. The truth surfaced slowly, like a bruise appearing hours after impact. I wasn't tired because I worked too much. I was tired because nothing I did required me. Not really. One evening, I stayed late at the office, not because I had to, but because leaving felt pointless. When I finally stepped outside, the city looked unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, because I had stopped noticing it. The lights, the noise, the movement, all of it continued without me. That night, I stood in my apartment and felt something unsettling. I didn't miss anyone. Not because I was alone, but because I had slowly removed myself from needing connection. It was safer that way, cleaner, lonelier. I tried to remember when I last felt genuinely present. Not productive, not distracted, present. The answer didn't come, and that scared me more than any crisis could have. Days blurred together. I woke up, I performed competence, I returned home, I repeated. Nothing was wrong enough to justify stopping. And that was the problem. I began to notice how often I delayed living. I'll rest later. I'll travel when things calm down. I'll think about meaning after this phase. The phase never ended. It just replaced itself. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. Not a letter this time. A message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who knew me before I learned how to disappear while remaining physically present. I don't know why I thought of you, it read, but I did. And I thought you should know. I'm leaving. No explanation. Just that. We met the following week. They looked older. So did I. But there was something else in their posture, a kind of quiet decision. You seem intact, they said after a moment. I am, I replied. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth either. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work, people we once knew, the polite geography of adulthood. Then they asked, "Are you happy?" I laughed reflexively. That's a big question. They didn't smile. It's a simple one, they said. The silence that followed was revealing. I don't know, I admitted. They nodded. I didn't either. For a long time. What changed? I asked. I got tired of surviving a life that never threatened me. That sentence stayed with me. They told me about their decision to leave. No plan, in certainty. Just an unwillingness to continue numbing themselves with stability. I realized I was living as a version of myself that no longer existed. They said, and I asked, and staying felt like lying. That night, alone again, I sat with that thought. Was I lying to myself? Or had I simply grown accustomed to a version of life that required nothing from my deeper self? The distinction mattered. I started paying attention to how often I avoided silence. Oh, how quickly I filled empty moments with noise. Oh, how rarely I asked myself difficult questions. I wasn't afraid of answers. I was afraid of disruption. One morning, I woke up with a strange clarity. If my life continued exactly as it was, nothing terrible would happen. And that realization terrified me, because it meant nothing meaningful would either. I took a day off work, sat in a park, watched people live visibly, arguing, laughing, failing, connecting. Their lives looked messy, real. Mine felt preserved, like something kept behind glass. I thought about the years ahead, not in terms of milestones, but sensations. Will they feel different? Or would time simply move faster as I noticed less? The answer felt obvious and unbearable. That evening, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a public one, just a private refusal. I refused to keep living without friction, without vulnerability, without risk. I didn't know what that would require. I only knew it would cost me the illusion of control. And for the first time in years, that felt like relief. I stood at my window, watching the city glow with borrowed purpose, and admitted something out loud. I can't keep living like this. The words didn't solve anything, but they opened a door I had kept sealed for too long. Some lives end with explosions. Others begin to unravel with a whisper. This was mine, and I sensed, without knowing how, that what came next would ask more of me than comfort ever had. After that night, something subtle but irreversible shifted. Nothing changed on the surface. I still woke up at the same time, still answered emails, still moved through familiar routines. But underneath, the agreement I had made with myself was broken. And once an agreement like that collapses, everything built on it begins to feel unstable. I started noticing how often my life ran on momentum alone. I would finish one task and immediately reach for the next. Not because it mattered, but because stopping felt dangerous. Stillness was no longer neutral. It was loud. At work, conversations felt hollow. Not because people were insincere, but because we all spoke in carefully edited versions of ourselves. I'm busy. Things are good. Can't complain. A shared language of avoidance. And for the first time, I felt allergic to it. One afternoon, during a meeting I had attended dozens of times before, I felt an unexpected panic. Not fear, pressure, like my body realized before my mind did that this version of life was no longer survivable. I excused myself and stepped outside, breathing too fast, heart racing without cause. That was when I understood something unsettling. I wasn't breaking down. I was waking up. Waking up, however, came with consequences. Sleep became unreliable. Thoughts arrived uninvited. Questions surfaced that refused to be postponed. What am I actually building? Who is this for? And what part of me is being erased in the process? I try to talk to people about it. Carefully at first. I feel disconnected, I said once, testing the words. They smiled sympathetically. Everyone feels that sometimes. The conversation moved on. I learned quickly that discomfort makes people nervous, especially when it doesn't come with a solution. I became quieter, not withdrawn, observant. I noticed how often people mistook endurance for strength, how often stability was used as proof of fulfillment, how rarely anyone asked whether their lives felt true, only whether they functioned. Weeks passed. The unease didn't fade. It sharpened. I found myself grieving something intangible. Not a person, not an opportunity, but the version of myself I had gradually abandoned. The one who used to feel things fully. The one who took risks without calculating the cost of exposure. One night, I pulled out an old notebook. Pages filled with unfinished thoughts, ideas, questions I once cared about. I barely recognized the handwriting. Who was I back then? And when did I decide that person was impractical? I started making small changes. Not announcements. Experiments. I declined invitations I didn't mean to accept. I stopped filling silence with distractions. I allowed boredom to exist without immediately solving it. Each choice felt minor. Each one terrified me. Then came the first real loss. A colleague I respected pulled me aside. You seem different, they said carefully. Less committed. I didn't argue, because they were right. I was less committed to pretending. That conversation lingered. It marked the moment my internal shift became externally visible. And visibility, I learned, has a cost. People prefer predictability over honesty. I began to understand why I had chosen numbness in the first place. It was efficient. It kept relationships uncomplicated. It made me reliable, but it also made me invisible. even to myself. One evening, I met the person who had sent the message again. They looked lighter, not happier, freer. "How's the unraveling?" they asked gently. I laughed despite myself. "Messy." They nodded. "That means it's real." We talked about fear. Not dramatic fear, the quiet kind. The fear of losing coherence. The fear of disappointing others. The fear of discovering that change doesn't guarantee meaning, only uncertainty. "I'm afraid I'll destroy a life that works," I admitted. They looked at me seriously. "Does it work?" they asked. Or does it just continue? That question stayed with me. Soon after, I did something that would have terrified the old version of me. I asked for time. Not a vacation. Not a break. Time without explanation. The response was polite, concerned, measured, but I could feel the shift. I was no longer safely understood. Without structure, days stretched. Uncomfortable, open. I walked without destination. Sat without agenda. Thought without resolution. At first, it felt like failure. Then, slowly, it felt like space. But space brings echoes. Regrets surfaced. Memories I had buried returned without permission. Moments where I had chosen safety over truth. People I had distanced myself from not because they hurt me, but because they saw me. That realization was hard to carry. One afternoon, standing in a grocery store aisle, I felt suddenly overwhelmed. By choice. By the absurdity of options. By the realization that freedom without direction can feel indistinguishable from being lost. I left without buying anything. Sat in my car and cried. Quietly. Without narrative. Just release. That night, I admitted something painful. I didn't know who I was without the systems that defined me. And that meant I had never actually met myself. I considered turning back. Recommitting. Resealing the door I had opened. The path was still there. The numbness still available. Comfort is always ready to welcome you back. But once you've seen the cost, returning feels like betrayal. Instead, I wrote a single sentence and taped it to my wall. Functioning is not the same as living. I read it every morning. Some days it inspired me. Other days it terrified me. Both reactions were honest. By the end of that season, my life looked worse on paper. Less secure, less defined, less impressive. But inside, something fragile had begun to breathe again. Not confidence, not clarity, awareness. I didn't know where this path led. I only knew that autopilot was no longer an option, and that whatever came next would require me to remain awake, even when waking hurt. There is a moment after the unraveling when you realize something important. You can't go back, not because the door is locked, but because you no longer fit through it. That's where I was. My days had lost their structure, but gained a strange density. Time no longer slipped past unnoticed. Each hour asked something of me, and for the first time, I didn't know how to answer. People began to ask questions. Not curious ones, concerned ones. "So, what are you doing now? What's the plan? How long is this phase?" I smiled politely. I had learned that most people aren't asking out of interest. They're asking for reassurance that their own choices remain valid. "I'm figuring things out," I said. That made them uncomfortable. Inside, the discomfort was sharper. Without roles to hide behind, I felt exposed. I wasn't a title, that I wasn't a routine, that I wasn't a schedule. I was just a person, awake, uncertain, unprotected. And some mornings that felt unbearable. I began to understand why people cling to identities long after they stop fitting. They offer shape, even when they suffocate. One night, unable to sleep, I wrote a list. Not goals, not dreams, losses, things I had given up quietly over the years. Curiosity, risk, depth, the willingness to be misunderstood. I stared at the page and felt a grief I had postponed for decades. No one had taken these things from me. I had traded them, slowly, carefully, for comfort. That was when anger arrived. Not explosive, focused. Anger at how easily I had accepted a life that asked nothing of my soul. Anger at how often I had dismissed my own restlessness as immaturity, anger at how long I had waited for permission. I decided to stop waiting. The decision didn't come as clarity. It came as refusal. I refused to rebuild the same life with slightly better habits. I refused to call safety fulfillment. I refused to mistake fearlessness for wisdom. I returned to the place where the shift had begun. The park. Same bench. Different person. I sat there for hours, watching people pass, and asked myself a final question. If no one ever applauded this life, would I still choose it? The answer terrified me, because it was yes. I began making choices that didn't make sense on paper. I said no to opportunities that required me to shrink. I said yes to conversations that risked discomfort. I reached out to people I had distanced myself from, not to reconnect, but to apologize. Some responded, some didn't. Both outcomes mattered. One message changed everything, from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. You once told me you didn't know what you wanted, but I'm glad you finally stopped pretending you did. I sat with that for a long time. Slowly, something new emerged. Not confidence, integrity. I stopped trying to sound certain. Stopped narrating my life as if it were already resolved. I spoke in present tense. I don't know yet. This matters to me. I'm scared, but I'm staying. The honesty cost me approval, but it returned something far more valuable. Alignment. Months passed. The external markers of success didn't return. Some never would. But internally, the noise quieted. Not because answers arrived, because I stopped betraying the questions. One evening, while walking home, I felt it clearly for the first time. I was no longer afraid of becoming someone else. I was afraid of becoming no one. And that fear was finally gone. I understood then that meaning doesn't arrive as revelation. It arrives as participation, as choosing again and again to remain awake in your own life, even when it would be easier to drift. I don't romanticize this ending. There is no guarantee, no neat resolution. Some days still feel heavy. Some doubts return, but they no longer own me. I learned this too late for some versions of myself, but not too late for the one who remains. And that is enough. If you're reading this and waiting for a sign, this isn't it. This is a reminder that a life can function perfectly while slowly erasing you. And that waking up is not a moment. It's a responsibility. When you choose, every day,